if Donald Trump fails in America, I imagine that will unleash a wokeness of the kind that we've never seen before.
Is there a feeling that the revolution has run out of momentum?
There is that feeling. That doesn't mean that it's true.
Help me understand the Russian mindset a bit better.
As I currently look at this, my sense is we're heading to a very bad deal for Ukraine and therefore the world. I think, if we're all being very honest, the rise of anti-immigration parties, as they're called, in truth, is a concern about the rise of Islam in Western Europe.
Hard to disagree. Today I'm joined by Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin is co-host of the Trigonometry podcast and author of An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. We're going to be talking about geopolitics, in particular Russia-Ukraine. We're going to be talking about Trump 2.0 and whether the MAGA movement is overstepping its electoral mandate. And we'll be talking about how Uzbekistan may have some lessons to teach Western liberal democracies. Welcome to First Light. Konstantin Kisin, great to have you on First Light.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Academics like to say that it was at the university that the cultural upheavals of our day really first began to break. It was on campus. But I like to remind them that actually it was the comedy circuit. It's really the comedians who are, because they're operating at the limits of the sayable, when those limits get drawn in a culture of conformity or censorship, it's on the stand-up circuit that you notice it first. Was that your impression?
I don't know. It's interesting. I haven't done stand-up since the pandemic, so I'm sure it's become radically pro-free speech and anti-woke in the meantime. I say that jokingly, of course. It hasn't, according to everything I know. But I do remember in around 2016, 2017, sort of looking around and noticing that maybe one or other two people thought that what was going on was very strange because it was very instant. There was a simultaneous, if you look at like the 2000s, the most popular comedian on TV was Frankie Boyle, who would make the most outrageous jokes. And in fact, I remember going to a few comedy shows myself as a punter in the early 2010s and thinking, this is a bit much. Maybe they need to take it easy. And then almost overnight, it suddenly became, you shouldn't say this, you can't say that, you're a white this, you're a male that. And it suddenly changed very, very quickly. And Francis and I looked around and thought there's something very strange going on. And then Brexit happened. And Brexit was when this whole culture of kindness and compassion and empathy was immediately exposed for the complete fraud that it was, because Francis and I, two people who voted Remain in that referendum, nonetheless looked around, and when all of these people who've been preaching about kindness and compassion for the last X number of years are now going on stage and doing material about how pensioners should kill themselves because they voted Leave. And I didn't think that, there was this idea invented in comedy about punching up and punching down. Very briefly, punching up is when you make fun of people who are perceived to have more power than you, and punching down is when they're perceived to have less power than you. I did not think that impoverished pensioners in the north of London who were struggling to pay their heating bills, even though they made the evil decision to vote for Brexit, were by that fact made powerful. And so this whole thing was revealed for the fraud that it was pretty quickly. And that's when my awareness of it really began.
In fact, I think we met at a closed doors conference in Oxford, I want to say 5-6 years ago.
2018.
2018, that's right. And it was a conference on academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of association more generally. And I remember that it was by invitation only. The venue was not disclosed until I think the day before. And just the irony of having, even just gathering to talk about the issue as a problem was difficult in one of our great institutions. But is your sense now, well, we've got Trump 2.0, we've got, full-scale federal war in the US against DEI, We've had, at the time of recording a few weeks ago, the UK Supreme Court judgment on trans, which effectively has clarified the Equality Act 2010. Is there a feeling that the revolution has run out of momentum from your point of view?
There is that feeling. That doesn't mean that it's true. I certainly have that sense, but of course we have to wait and see. And I think many of us who've been opposing this woke stuff are quite tired of the process. It's not the most pleasant or enjoyable process. You know that much better than I do. And so we are keen, I think, to see every small ray of light that makes it through as the beginning of the dawn of whatever we imagine it to be. If Donald Trump fails in America, or indeed if he fails by going too far, which is always possible, I imagine that will unleash a wokeness of the kind that we've never seen before. Because the argument will be, well, we told you this guy was X, Y, Z, and look, he actually was. And so I am troubled by all this talk about a third term and all these other things. I think there's a risk of giving a lot of ammunition to those people. And of course, if the economy goes bad, either because of actions or simply because it's the economic cycle, again, that would be I think you'll see a big swing in the opposite direction. So my point is that we seem to be in a period when the pendulum is swinging quite rapidly. But I think you're also right. In America, I think it's undoubtedly the case that wokeness was on the ballot to a large extent, and it was defeated to a large extent. I think in the UK, not only the Supreme Court case you mentioned, but we could go down the list. I mean, West Streeting banned puberty blockers on the NHS. This is a Labour health secretary. I don't know if you saw this. I read an article by Tony Blair recently talking about how net zero extremism is a problem. Something you and I think, have both been trying to articulate for some time, while being, called all sorts of names and so on. So there are positive changes, but I also look at something like education. I have a young child, and I know from direct personal experiences that books about the possibility of selecting your gender at the age of 3 are still readily available. In fact, still actively being pushed. There are schools who are still catching up to the woke thing, as opposed to catching up to the fact that woke isn't really as big anymore. So how long it takes us to even if we have destroyed the central tumor, how long it takes us to find all the metastatic tumors and get rid of them, that's the best case scenario. That might take some time. Have we broken the back of it? That is my hope.
And I mean, is it the case that, at least in cultural terms, we are the 51st state, and as it were, what happens in DC effectively will have ramifications for us, that we're still, in effect, if there's a positive change in Washington, then things will get better over here, or not? I mean, one might say on the trans issue, Britain has led the way. Some of our feminists, J.K. Rowling, and celebrities, J.K. Rowling, we think of Kathleen Stock, Julie Bindel, and others.
Maya Forstater,
and so on. There's something that and maybe that's not quite true. Maybe we are sort of setting the pace of cultural resistance to some of these woke excesses.
Well, we have become one informational space, which is why the Vice President of the United States, for example, is so frequently talking about free speech problems in the UK, and likewise why so many of us are invited to comment on American issues, which I do very reluctantly, and only because I do actually have the luxury of spending some time there and seeing it with my own eyes. I think it really fundamentally depends on what happens. I think one of the things that all of us have to concede is the Trump administration is doing many of the things it talked about prior to being elected, but it's also doing quite a lot of things that weren't on the ballot box. And those are things that are quite dramatic. The sort of open antipathy towards Europe, for example, is quite off-putting to many people, I think. The territorial expansionist aspirations, likewise. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if the correction in America does not become an overcorrection or a correction that goes out of control in some kind of terrible new direction, then I think it will be inevitable that everyone in the rest of the Anglosphere in particular, but the Western world more generally, will say, well, if they can fix their border, so can we. If they can fix such and such issue, so can we. If it's proved that a culture where freedom of speech within the reasonable bounds that we all, I think, would accept, is better than a culture of highly restrictive speech. Again, you would imagine that there would be an appetite to download that to the UK. If, however, our American friends go too far, I fear that would be very off-putting to a lot of Europeans and may tank the electoral prospects of many centre and centre-right parties in Europe. And the Pierre Poilievre situation is a prime example of what happens when America throws its weight around in a way that puts allies off in that way. So I am very apprehensive in this moment. I think it could go either way.
I mean, it's clear that a lot of the rhetoric coming from Washington towards Europe could be interpreted in that way. I think that's fair. But to what extent do you think, I mean, I'm thinking back to the Vice President's speech in Munich that really many European leaders found traumatizing. I mean, the German organizing the Munich Security Conference at the end actually burst into tears as he was closing the conference. It was extraordinary to witness. And I interpreted that speech, and I interpret the heated rhetoric from DC directed at Europe more as being directed at European leaders that I think, the MAGA crowd, those now in the ascendant DC, interpret or believe to be increasingly out of touch with their electorates, increasingly disconnected from the founding values that Americans always thought they shared with Europe, and especially shared with Britain. And so I think a lot of the noise is being directed at the technocrats. It's the thought. Somebody put it to me the other day. It's a little bit like the Americans don't hate Europe. They hate. It's like hating FIFA. You hate FIFA because you love football. It's a bit like the Americans. They can't stand these out of touch European technocrats because they love Europe, and they see that Europe and what they love about Europe is being smothered through all of these kind of cultural forces, demographic changes, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that's fair or not.
No, I think that's probably the intention. But I think when you combine it with the sort of sense of, we don't really care about Ukraine, we'll just pull out as quickly as we possibly can. That's been some of the rhetoric. And I'm not saying that that's been the rhetoric from the very top, but you saw the leaked signal messages from the debate about how to strike some targets. But again, there was a lot of the Europeans are doing this. I just think when people talk in those broad brush categories, there's always the risk of the correct criticism of European elites becoming criticisms of Europe more generally, because there are some differences between our cultures. We forget this because we speak the same language, but Americans is different to us and we're different to them. I do take your point. I think it's true. And I'm grateful. I was very grateful that J.D. Vance made that speech in Munich, and even more grateful that he made the speech at the AI summit a couple of weeks or a few days prior.
Which, if it had just been that AI speech in Paris, that itself would have made it the most consequential VP visit in a very long time.
And that was magnificent, because what he fundamentally exposed is that we have become extremely risk-averse as a civilization, and we have got to reset our attitude to risk, and that safetyism thing that Jonathan Haidt and others have talked so much about is something we're just going to have to let go if we want to be the civilization that we have been.
Now, to go back to Ukraine, I think we can't just skate past Ukraine. It's an issue that is not just close to your heart, it's part of your identity. You've got Ukrainian mother, a Russian father. You've just done some wonderful exchanges with your father, a 3-part conversation, and you disagree about that, but you model civil disagreement, and I think I've been watching a lot of mainstream media on Ukraine and Russia, and it's I wouldn't say it's unhinged, but they find it very, very difficult to inhabit both sides. And there's this sort of, maybe it's a case of World War II brain, where Zelensky is Churchill, Putin is Hitler, and Trump and Vance are Chamberlains for refusing to be as aggressive as maybe the Biden administration was. I think you bring a lot of you bring a very granular approach to what's going on there. At the time of recording, attempts are being made to negotiate with Moscow. It's not looking very hopeful. Where do you see this going? Is it just a completely futile effort by the Americans to get some peace negotiations going? And how do you see this ending?
Well, so many questions there. It's a difficult issue. I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack. So let me just take a few of the points, and they're quite separate. So first of all, on the framing of, Zelensky's Churchill, if people want to make that argument, I actually don't have a particular problem with it. Zelensky very courageously marshaled his country in its defense with the consent of the people, by the way. The ordinary Ukrainian, having had their country invaded already in 2014 and essentially watched pieces of their land being taken away, were not prepared to let it happen again. That's just a fact. Whether people who like that or not is irrelevant. That is true. It's also true that it is because of his leadership that they were able to withstand an invasion by a much more powerful country. And it's because of his leadership that they were able to secure the help from the West in order to do that. My issue is that it was very clear to me from I said this on Question Time literally like 3 days after the conflict started, that the way this conflict inevitably would end, and I'm the most pro-Ukrainian person you're ever going to find, is a settlement negotiation. And what Ukraine needed to do was to give Russia a bloody nose, to deter further aggression, and then to come to the table and to say, look, you've got Crimea, we're probably not going to get it back ever. Let's just accept that that's happened, but in exchange, we're going to have permanent, physical security on the border. In other words, a peacekeeping force or something like that. That was always, for me, the objectives the Ukrainians were pursuing. And my issue with the Biden administration and others around Europe as well was, well, if you're saying Slava Ukraini, Zelensky is Churchill, then you have to give him the level of support that the Americans under Lend-Lease gave to Britain and the Soviet Union and other countries. In other words, you have to throw the kitchen sink at this and help the Ukrainians actually defend themselves. What we ended up with is, in my view, the worst of both worlds, which is partial support combined with partial practical support combined with very high levels of emotional support. In other words, no, please keep fighting and we'll give you just enough to not lose rapidly. And that's partly because in this emotional frenzy that we saw 3 years ago and since, none of these people actually asked themselves what the end result was going to be. How is this going to end? And therefore, what they do to people who ask questions about this, and this is very sad for me as someone who's very pro-Ukrainian, is they say, well, you're not supporting Ukraine sufficiently with your rhetoric. And they will criticize you for it. But no one ever asks them what they think should happen, because doing more of what we're currently doing is only hurting Ukraine. I mean, most people don't care about Russian soldiers dying. I care about both peoples being killed as a result of this war, but primarily Ukrainians, of course. I don't think the policy of just continuing the conflict without offering them support they need is rational. It doesn't help Ukraine to do that. So my first claim is that we failed to back up our words with practical action. And that is why the Ukrainians have ended up despite their heroism, absolute heroism, despite hundreds of thousands, I expect at this point, of young men laying down their lives for their country bravely in a way that I think is to be celebrated and deserves all the praise that we can give them. Despite that, I don't think the result we've got to is what any of us would have wanted, because that support wasn't given to them properly. So that's the first argument that I would say. The second argument is about what, a lot of people like to argue about NATO expansion. And I think it's a perfectly valid point to point this out. The one thing that never gets asked of those people, and I think it's a very important thing to ask, is if NATO hadn't expanded eastwards, where do you think Vladimir Putin's tanks or his influence would be now in Eastern Europe? And we know from history, we know from pure geopolitics analysis, that Russia expands westwards every time it can. For all sorts of economic and historical and geographical reasons, it needs to expand westwards to feel more secure. So if NATO hadn't expanded, well, Vladimir Putin might not be in war in Ukraine because he might be in control of all of Eastern Europe. And is that a price we were willing to pay for that? That's a whole different conversation that seems to me never gets had. In terms of the negotiations, I think negotiations at this point are necessary, but I've said for a long time, including prior to the election of President Trump, that in my very non-expert assessment, I don't see how you can have a real negotiation when you keep signaling that you're desperate for negotiations to go as quickly as possible. And also when you're frankly unwilling to have a stick as well as a carrot. The Trump administration's offering seems to be, we'll send this guy who doesn't know anything about Ukraine over to Moscow. He'll be really nice to President Putin. We'll say that Putin is not a murderer. He's not a dictator. He's a great guy and we want to do business with him. But what do you do when he then inevitably starts messing you around, because that's in his interest? He knows you want to wrap this up quickly. He knows you don't care really about the outcome. So you're then in a position where you're increasingly forced to demand more and more concessions from Ukraine without being able to demand anything of Russia in return. And that's essentially where the negotiations are currently ending up. Russia is basically going, oh, you want a deal? Okay, well, get the Ukrainians to give this up and to give this up and to give this up and to give this up. We want them to have an army that's incapable of defending their country at the end of this. We don't want any foreign, forces on the ground, etc. So my concern is that the deal the Ukrainians laid down their lives for is not likely to be forthcoming, given the way that the American administration is approaching this. And for that reason, I think there is some merited criticism of that approach, while also, I wrote a whole article and did a very popular video about why Zelensky really messed up in the Oval Office. So I really tried to have a balanced perspective on this. But as I currently look at this, my sense is we're heading to a very bad deal for Ukraine and therefore the world. And this is why I say it, James. Why is it a bad deal for the world? The first and most obvious thing, I think, to anyone who follows this even remotely closely is Ukraine was in a position where it was encouraged to give up the nuclear weapons it had in its possession. Now, there's some debate about, did they have command and control? Separate conversation. The fact of the matter is, if we live in a world in which powerful countries can invade smaller countries, and there is no, the world policeman has said, I'm not interested in policing, I'm done. I was discredited by beating up Iraq and Afghanistan and messing around in Libya and messing around in those places. I'm taking a step back. I've got stuff to look at after at home. I've got 3 kids well, then you end up in a world in which everyone needs to get a gun. And then the risk of nuclear proliferation seems to me utterly inevitable, because it would be the most logical thing for every small country to pursue. If the Americans aren't going to protect us from Russia invading or China invading or whoever invading, we have to get the most powerful deterrent we possibly can. So there's the risk of nuclear proliferation. And then, of course, if Ukraine comes out of this negotiation with no security other than some words on a piece of paper, I think it's inevitable that it will be invaded again down the line, at which point we're back where we started, but worse.
That's extremely helpful and clarifying. And help me understand the Russian mindset a bit better. I know that almost immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, there was this big debate among the Bolsheviks, right at the top, between Lenin and Stalin, as to what extent is this a Russian revolution, or to what extent is it a Soviet revolution? And the argument that won, as I understand it, is that we can't use the word Russia. We've got to use the word Soviet. We've got to make sure that local nationalisms are properly accommodated by this sort of neutralizing commitment to being Soviet. And so you had decades and decades and decades where this very lively Russian patriotic sentiment was effectively forcibly suppressed with something like the modern liberal doctrine of multiculturalism. And that is to say, we can't prioritize
we will do there, but we can come back to it. Sorry.
So, and maybe this is purely speculative. What I'm trying to understand...
Everything else you're saying is 100%.
Is one way of understanding the resurgence of Russian nationalism is if it had been sort of oddly suppressed in the Soviet era, and now it's sort of come back to the fore, and there's a sense that Russia is not just any old country. The Americans mock it for just being a petrol station with some nuclear weapons. And, yes, economically, it's not huge. But it's more, they feel as if they're more than a country. They're a civilizational state. And we took on Napoleon, they think. We took on, and we beat him, and we took on Hitler, and we beat them, and we liberated Europe. And we're not being we're not being honoured somehow, and we're not allowed to show have a sense of spirit and confidence in what it is to be Russian. Or is it just a sort of personal political cult around Putin that he's cynically exploiting nationalist sentiment to achieve his own ends?
I will confess, I don't know that the nationalist angle is what I would reach for here. That's not my perspective. I don't hear... There is, of course, a fringe of those people in Russia who are Russian nationalists. But actually, Russia has retained its imperial worldview and internal perspective, in the sense that an Armenian would not say that they're ethnically Russian. We have two words for this. As you know, I got into a lot of trouble trying to explain the difference between Englishness and Britishness to British and English people, which just makes me laugh every time. But in Russian, we have two words, Ruski, which means an ethnic Russian, and Россиянин, which means a Russian citizen. And it's effectively the difference between saying I'm ethnically English and I'm British, which is what I am, right? So I don't think this is a Ruski nationalism issue. I think it's an issue of, look, let's be honest, Russia was defeated in the Cold War and humiliated. I don't necessarily agree with this view that the Americans came over and sort of rubbed their foot in Russia's face, exactly. But losing a war is very painful, it's very unpleasant. And unless you have a kind of a rational explanation for why it's your own responsibility, it's very, very tempting to then blame the other people for having defeated you.
I know, for example, that British diplomats at the end of the 80s and the 90s would talk about the Cold War having come to an end. American diplomats preferred the rhetoric of "we won."
Yes, and that's the difference between the British and American psyche, among other things, I would say. But my point is that, this narrative of the Americans abusing Russia in the 90s, I'm sure there were people who were doing that. But at the same time, I remember as a boy in Russia in the early 90s being given out cans of Spam and broiler American chicken legs because there was also so-called humanitarian aid. And I think actually in some ways that was much more insulting to Russians, the sort of like hand-me-downs and all of this. So the defeat that they experienced and the experiment with democracy, which was so painful and unpleasant for most people, is what then produces the correction of Putin, who comes in and he nationalizes the corruption other than allowing it, nationalizes the crime, nationalizes the oligarchy. So oligarchs are no longer the people who manage to steal as much as possible, but are appointed. An oligarch is now an appointed position within the Russian government. And so that corruption everything's been brought under control. Some of the petrol station money has been pumped into making the big cities nice, building infrastructure, etc., etc. So the Putin personal project really benefited from the rise in oil prices and the ability to spend some of that money on the populace. But I don't think this is about Russian nationalism. This is about geopolitics, as far as I can tell. And part of the reason I sense this is, in the conversation you mentioned with my dad, his job used to be in the Russian government. It's one of the reasons we disagree so strongly, to effectively, in the early 90s, attempt to bring back the countries which were fleeing the Russian orbit as much as they possibly could. This is always going to be Russia's natural inclination. Most of Russia's industrial and intellectual and other assets, most of those assets are contained in its westernmost 20%. The rest of the country is pretty much a backwater with some natural resources. And that area of Russia is extraordinarily vulnerable to invasion from the West.
This is effectively the corridor from St. Petersburg down through Moscow to the Black Sea.
Yes. And so if you are so vulnerable in that area, you're naturally going to want to extend the cushion westwards as much as possible. And so the reason that, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and other countries in Eastern Europe are actually on a per capita basis providing the highest amount of aid to Ukraine of anyone, including America. The reason they're doing that is they know history. They know what happens when Russia is powerful.
And even though they are in NATO and, the risks of triggering Article 5 are are there in a way that they weren't with the Ukraine, still they feel threatened, and plausibly so.
Yes, and also the question becomes, I don't remember if you remember that great scene from, I think it's Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, where the civil servant is essentially attempting to find out at which point the minister would be prepared to go to nuclear war. And he gives all sort of scenarios about, there is there's an uprising in Poland that is such and such. Is after everything we've seen, are we confident that, a senile President Biden, for example, is likely to go to nuclear war over a small incursion into Estonia? Are we certain about this? Are Estonians certain about this, more importantly? I think this has thrown a lot of these types of questions into the conversation. So I think it would be a very unwise president of Poland or Latvia or Estonia, Lithuania, who says, we're NATO, therefore everything's fine. They certainly do not feel that way. And I think for historical reasons. So all I'm trying to say is I think that in addition to the Putin personal project, which I'm sure is a big part of this, which is, how do you want to be remembered? Tsar Vladimir. Because that's what he is at this point. He's been in power for 26 years at this point, right? This isn't a democracy in any sense at all. How are you going to be remembered? Well, if you're remembered as someone who put Russia back on the map, that's a wonderful legacy to be left with. But also, Russia has very important strategic interest in expansion westwards. And it will seek to do that at every opportunity when it's afforded to, which is why I believe in having a very strong deterrent, which is why I believed it was important to support Ukraine to prevent any more of this happening.
And yet the risks, say, to Central Asia, you think probably not. Risk of provoking China, maybe, or risk of provoking India, which perhaps they don't want to do. What's going on in those sort of post-Soviet satellite states? I know you've just come back from Uzbekistan. In fact, you spent some years there growing up, I think. Tell us about that. What about your trip and what the mood is there on the ground? They're not feeling threatened?
That part of the world seems relatively stable. I certainly wouldn't claim any expertise on it, James. I wrote an article about the trip to Uzbekistan, but from a very different perspective. I don't know if you're keen to...
Yeah, I'd love to hear about it, yeah. I mean, because it's basically, it's quite an autocratic regime, but it's emerged from the 90s, pretty confident and pretty successful. I
imagine most of your audience is less interested in Uzbekistan itself. But the reason I bring up the article, which I know you've read, is that I thought that there was very valuable lessons for us to think about in the West, and particularly in Europe specifically.
Say more.
Well, I think it's time for us to recognize something that I think has been we've been obfuscating about for some time, which is there is this great pretense that we're all very concerned in Europe about mass immigration. And you can speak to Lib Dem politicians and they'll tell you, oh yeah, immigration is a big problem, because they hear it on the doorstep, of course. But I think if we were being really honest, we would recognize that, for example, we don't seem to be that concerned about the fact that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have come to our country in recent years. They don't seem to be causing any problems.
Left and right are pretty pleased at the generosity that the Brits have shown.
Yeah, and rightly so. What about Hong Kongers? Are we deeply concerned about a few 100,000, as I understand it, or maybe 100-something thousand Hong Kongers coming here as refugees? I don't get any anti-Hong Kong sentiment recently. Over 1 million Polish people came. It was disruptive to some extent and labor market, but the brickies who lost their jobs because Polish lads were willing to do it for slightly less, I don't remember them hating Poles or saying Poles should be removed. I remember people talking about the importance of keeping the numbers sensible. I remember people talking about the need to make sure the labor market, these people are not being taken advantage of, as many of them were being taken advantage of. So we were having a conversation of a very different type. I think if we're all being very honest, the rise of anti-immigration parties, as they're called, in truth, is a concern about the rise of Islam in Western Europe.
Hard to disagree.
Let's be honest, right? Now, the question then is, what do we do about that? Because I think that most people, is my sense, most people don't actually have any particular problem with Muslims per se. What I think they have a problem with is the extreme manifestations of some particular ways of thinking within that group of people, which we might call Islamism, let's say. And the argument is there, and I break it down. I think there are different schools of thought. I mean, obviously, the progressive response is there is no problem. There's no such thing as Islam. And look at the far right over here, the far right, the far right, the far right, which I think is dishonest. I think we can all recognize that the overwhelming majority of our fellow Muslim, our fellow citizens who are Muslim, are decent, normal people with whom we're perfectly capable of coexisting. At least that's my perspective. But we also have to recognize that 75% of MI5's terror caseload is Islamic extremism. 90% of the people on their terror watch list are Islamist extremism. If you look at the number of people who are being killed in the attacks and all sorts of other things that are going on there, it's a problem of a unique kind. Now, the question is, what do we do about that? And where? And by the way, where do we think it comes from? There are two schools of thought, I think, between the people who are willing to acknowledge that reality. One is to say, read the Quran, look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and this is, these people will say, a violent book, a violent ideology, with a violent history. And so when you, Konstantin, say we can coexist with our Muslim brothers and sisters, you are just ignorant to the reality of what this faith represents, which that's an argument we can have. I don't think it's a particularly useful argument at this stage, simply because we have a very significant Muslim population, and that is a reality that I don't think we're ever going to get away from. And so the question is, how do we encourage the forces within the Muslim community who are willing to integrate, who are willing to be peaceful and moderate and sensible? And also, how do we deal with the extremists? And what I saw in Uzbekistan, this is a very long introduction to what I'm trying to articulate, is a country which has no radical Islam in it, really, where it's a Muslim country, but Christians and Jews are not persecuted. Alcohol is sold everywhere. Islamic dress is not only not pushed, but actually, some girls wear hijabs and some girls wear skirts. And the burqa is banned in public. You cannot have a job. You can't work for the government if you want to display overtly religious dress, or even beards for men. I'm not suggesting that we bring that here particularly. A lot of hipsters would be in trouble. But
this is a Muslim majority country. Yes. That has emerged from 70 years of Soviet communism, that has in effect, it sounds like a secular, mildly autocratic government, allowing allowing a relative degree of freedom, personal freedoms, and a wide variety of compliance with standard Islamic dress codes and preferences.
You kind of wear what you want,
right.
Actually. So it's not really being. In fact, I think the forces that are pushing against the government are the Islamic forces, which are trying to encourage more young people to adopt this. But the government is very strong. There's a great irony that the first president of Uzbekistan was called Islam Karimov, and he was known for being very firm of not allowing religious extremism to flourish. Anyway, this is very long-winded. But my point is this. I think the debate about whether, it's Islamic extremism or Islam fails to recognize the reality on the ground, which is there are lots of Muslims in Britain, and we're going to have to coexist in some way. Now, how do we do that? Well, I think the way we do that is to recognize that actually, if you look at it objectively, we in Europe have been much weaker on dealing with extremism than most Muslim countries. Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has only very recently been banned in this country, has been banned in almost every Muslim country in the world for decades now. I have people that I know who come from places like the UAE, who come to Britain and say, I cannot believe what you allow extremists in this country to do. And so my argument is not that we need authoritarianism. My argument is we have to make a very clear delineation between moderate Muslims and extremists. And we have to say, if you want to be moderate and sensible, you are welcome. And not only that, we will go out of our way to help you become part of our society. We will be extra welcoming and friendly. I don't have any problem with being extra welcoming and friendly to people who want to become part of our society. I think we ought to be, actually, if we've allowed them to come to our country. But on the other hand, we have to be extraordinarily intolerant of the intolerant, and particularly of the extremes. And we should be looking at everything we can do on that front. And that's what they do in many Muslim countries. And I think we frankly should be learning from them at this point.
You've named, just sort of in passing, alluded to Karl Popper, the great philosopher's framing of this puzzle, the paradox of tolerance. In order to create a maximally tolerant society, you have to have the appetite to be intolerant. And I suppose the worry would be with that approach is that the weakness that I think you correctly draw attention to isn't just, a kind of surface issue in liberal democracy, but a kind of part of our DNA. That we've got this idea that freedom, and particularly freedom of religion, which was part of, really where freedom of speech and freedom of association really come alive as an issue in Europe and Britain, and it's what driving the American experiment. Of course, it's first and foremost freedom of religion, and therefore we're somehow cutting against the grain of who we are if we're imposing any kind of restrictions on freedom of worship, freedom to comply with our religious beliefs. I mean, the French have tried it. You might say that they've actually been less successful in their more quite aggressive policy of laïcité, where you've got very, very strict, something possibly closer to Uzbekistan rules than we've had over here. And the argument might be actually live and let live has allowed us to, pull off integration a little bit better than the French have. What would you say to that? I mean, is it just a paradox that's just at the heart of what Britain is, that we want to push freedom? Is it, whatever the Lib Dems might say, could we imagine a government, particularly a Labour government, that is extremely reliant on the Muslim vote? I think Muslims vote for Labour at something like 80 to 90%. And is it politically possible or palatable?
I think what is politically possible or palatable is highly contextual, and I think we saw a very unpleasant manifestation of that during COVID. I never would have imagined that some of the restrictions that were introduced in this country during COVID could have been conceived by a British Prime Minister, not least the British Prime Minister who at that time claimed to be a liberal.
So much for liberalism being in our DNA.
Well, in the true, a liberal in what I consider to be the true sense, which is someone who prioritizes human freedom.
You're allowed out of your house. Yeah.
Right. That seems to me like a pretty un-British thing to do. But we saw that when people perceive that there's a very serious threat to their way of life, they're willing to make adjustments. Now, as it happens in that particular instance, the adjustments were extraordinarily ill-advised, in my opinion. But what I'm saying is that I think, no, I don't think the Labour government is going to do those things. Nor am I, by the way, I think it's important to clarify, I'm not advocating that we prevent women in hijabs from working in the council.
But one example might be halal slaughter, for example, or possibly
this is all like
cousin marriage or...
Well, cousin marriage, I think, irrespective of any religious issue, should be banned because it just should be banned. And I think it's quite obvious why, not the genetic consequences of it and so on, right? Cousin marriage in and of itself, I think, irrespective of people's backgrounds, should not be happening. But what I mean is something else, which is, can we get much firmer about deporting people who've committed violent crimes, particularly terrorist-related crimes? I think we've been over-indexing people's right to a family life and to all sorts of other things, in terms of not removing people from our country. I think that in a society that during this woke period has become absolutely obsessed with hate speech, it's interesting why we would tolerate hate preachers who do preach hate in our country. Why are we providing benefits and social housing to illegal immigrants, but actually immigrants? I'm an immigrant myself, and I don't understand why people should be welcomed here and then given benefits. Presumably, we want people coming here who are going to be net contributors. That's how I would have thought about it. And it just seems to me that we should be absolutely removing anyone from this country who is a criminal, particularly with terrorist links. I think we should be much harsher on imprisoning those people and imprisoning them in such a way that they can't then indoctrinate their fellow prisoners, which is a lot of what happens. We should be banning outright, Islamist extremist organizations, which we're not doing, like countries like the UAE and others. That's where I think we start. And I think we just have to, I believe that we have to take the Muslim community at their word. The Muslim community say that, and I think we should take them at their word, that Muslims are peaceful, decent people who want to be part of the society. That's my experience of the overwhelming majority of Muslims I take. I assume, therefore, there would be nobody who's more interested in rooting out extremism of the Islamist variety than our fellow British citizen Muslims.
One big problem, of course, is that it's not clear who speaks for British Muslims, and it's not necessarily the fault of British Muslims. It's just a religion that is much more diffuse in it doesn't really have a center of gravity. I mean, will occasionally maybe appeal to a caliph, but broadly speaking, it doesn't have an archbishop of Canterbury. It's got
community leaders.
It's got community leaders, and yet
they don't seem to be particularly representative necessarily.
Yeah.
But my point is, I'm less interested in what the British Muslim community leaders think. My sense is that, as I say, we have to look. There are certain things that we're told, and I think there's some truth to them, which is that Muslims are the biggest victims of Islamist violence, which is true around the world. And most Muslims are decent, peaceful people. So if those two things are true, I can't see why it wouldn't be in the interest of the Muslim community, above all others, that we really do a much better job of cracking down on Islamist extremism.
And one of the problems is it's not the ordinary decent Muslim people, and it's not even the politicians. I mean, the political will is there. I remember just a few years ago, it took Theresa May years when she was Home Secretary just to deport Abu Qatada to Jordan, because the claim, the defense that his lawyers ran very successfully for many years was that there was a risk that some of the evidence used in his prospective trial in Jordan may or may not have been procured using torture, and therefore this kept him in, made it impossible to deport him for years and years and years. So it's not just a problem of political will. We're caught in this legislative labyrinth, dominated, of course, by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and a whole load of other international agreements too. I mean, from your point of view, do you think, and this may just be the direction of travel politically anyway?
Can I just pick up on that before you ask the question, James, just very briefly? I don't know if you've had this experience, but I have this experience, which is when I talk to any politician in the center or center-right about the ECHR, they all think we should leave.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But none of them ever say it when they're in office.
Yeah.
And all of them say it when they've left office. In other words, Rishi Sunak now says we should leave the ECHR.
You're answering the question I was going to ask. I mean, why is it so
cowards.
difficult?
Because they're cowards. Let's be honest, right? They all know what we should do. They just refuse to do it. And
they see the numbers. They know that, yes, it would be wildly unpopular with the chattering classes in Islington and Hampstead and Oxford and Cambridge, but they can also see the electoral capital. They see, a populist party surging that is, well, at least until recently, has gone. Even they've gone pretty quiet too on they're maybe not on Strexit, getting out of Strasbourg, but certainly on deportations and migration, and certainly on the Islam question. The big populist leader Nigel Farage is he's very, very wary of addressing the question.
Well, I think Nigel is trying to make the point that I'm trying to make, which is I think we've got lots of Muslims in this country,
and we got to learn to live and it's possible and desirable.
It is absolutely desirable that the society we have is the one we have. That's the starting point. Even if you're someone who just hates Muslims, you still have to accept this. You have to accept the reality that we are where we are. There are people online who like to talk about mass deportations, the idea that we're going to uproot 4 million people and remove them to the country.
For no reason whatever.
For no reason other than their ethnicity or religion. I don't see that. The country we would become is the country we would all then flee, I think, in that situation, frankly, right? So then what we've got to do is find ways of coexisting. And that means we have to purge the extremists from our midst. Otherwise, we will never get over this. And that's the problem I think we should be trying to solve, rather than arguing about, is this real Islam or not real Islam. I understand those arguments. I'm just trying to make a more practical argument. I think that's the argument that Nigel my sense, is trying to make as well, which is, I don't think we need to talk about an entire community of people as the problem, because they're not the problem. The problem is extremism. Let's deal with the extremism. Let's be extremely thorough about removing people who shouldn't be here, and let's be extremely unapologetic about doing so. I am very uncomfortable with the possibility of anyone being removed who's not committed a crime, who's not done anything wrong, who, etc., etc. I am also extremely keen for everyone who's committed a crime to be removed immediately. And that's where I think we're getting it wrong. I think we are over-indexing all of these humanitarian concerns. I don't want people to be sent to a torture chamber in Jordan. I don't think those are our only options. Either they stay here or that happens. I think there's got to be some kind of intermediary solution. And of course, in the meantime, we have got to start finding a way to turn the boats around, because let's be honest, people, they're not fleeing war-torn France. They're fleeing. This is ridiculous, and we all know it's ridiculous, and this country is being taken advantage of. So,
and yet, why is it so difficult? It's so easy to see the problem, and it's so hard to achieve any kind of political cut through, even within those circles where you might expect the politicians to be speaking up and putting forward a legislative program that would just...
My sense is they're scared. And also, as you well know, probably better than I, the Conservative Party is not one party anymore.
True.
It has... There is... I like to tell this story because it just boggled the mind. One of the times I was on a TV program, was in the green room, there was a Conservative MP. It was right after the last election. And I said to him, why do you think you lost? And he said, well, we went too hard to the right, and we lost to the Lib Dems. There is a group of people within the Conservative Party who perceive the problem that way. And
that losing 750,000 votes to the Lib Dems is far worse than the losing 4.1 million votes to Reform.
It may be true of their individual constituency, but in terms of the broader country, it's a ridiculous argument, because we all know, truthfully, they lost that election because of the rise of Reform. We all know this. So they are difficult to reconcile with some of the things that we're talking about, and perhaps they're just socially very progressive in some ways, even Conservative MPs. But the truth of it is, as I think we've just had, as we sit here, a by-election in which Reform won by a very, very slender margin, but nonetheless won.
But a colossal swing.
Colossal swing. If they continue to ignore not only the wishes of the people, but frankly, at this point, the needs of the country, then what they will end up with is electoral wipeout. Now, whether that leads to a Reform majority is a different conversation, but ultimately they will be punished for this. And if they want to retain the longest existing party in the Western world, as I understand it, they're going to have to realize that what many of them will say in private is what they have to start saying in public. And that is the thing that I find most unpleasant about all of this, James. And maybe I'm naive, and maybe politics is just not my game, and I don't. But the spectacle of many otherwise decent and courageous people simply being unwilling to say publicly the thing that they all believe, that they all know is the right thing, simply because they're worried about what The Guardian is going to write about them, or what James O'Brien is going to say on LBC, or any of this. I find that shocking, frankly. I find it so disappointing. It's one of the reasons that while I really try and stay away from party politics as much as possible, I was so protective and supportive of Suella Braverman, because whether you like her or dislike her, whether you think she got everything right or whatever, I just thought here was a politician who actually said what they meant and meant what they said, and actually tried to do something when they were in power. And, obviously the counter argument to that is, look what happened to her as a result. That's why none of them want to repeat it. She was forced out. But I thought she was principled and correct in her positions. And I always have the sense, like, if 10 people actually stood up and said it, we might actually get somewhere.
Final question. This podcast is called First Light. We're looking for glimmers of dawn, glimmers of hope, however long the night might be. What is it that gives Konstantin Kisin hope for the future?
I think that those of us who've articulated some of the concerns that I just have, and the stuff we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, used to be, we sort of felt like we were Soviet dissidents meeting in a private flat somewhere.
Swapping samizdat.
Yes. I don't quite feel that way anymore, and I don't think you do either. And I understand that, you're here in Cambridge, you are outnumbered, and I wouldn't say outgunned, but certainly outnumbered. But again, I feel like the balance is shifting somewhat. And so to the extent that those of us who are talking about this have bigger audiences, we will give politicians, I hope, more cover to talk about these issues more honestly. A lot of them are completely unwilling to do so at the moment, but nonetheless, I think some of them are encouraged. And if that process continues, we might get to a balanced position. And that's, by the way, I think it's important to say, that's the only thing I'm really after personally. I do not want a runaway right-wing dominated conversation. I think the right can go wrong in certain instances. And I think the compassion, empathy angle is not irrelevant. It's one I struggle with personally, as my wife keeps reminding me, but I think it's useful. It's a useful perspective on some things. I'm interested in balance. I'm interested in us moving forward together. I don't like the divisiveness. I don't like being part of it, the divisiveness, as I've had to be. Because once you start cutting bits of children, it's difficult to not be divisive about that, right? But broadly speaking, if we could return to a sense of, we're all trying to, this is our country. We're all on the same team, ultimately. I'm on Team Britain, and I don't necessarily agree with James O'Brien, but I want us both to live in a society in which we can both be happy with the society we have. I don't necessarily agree with lots of other people, but I want us to live in a society where we can coexist peacefully. And so if balancing our conversation up a little bit more, if having more conversations across the aisle, as we're increasingly trying to do on trigonometry, if engaging more with different perspectives is what's happening, which I think it might be, then that to me is a hope. Because also, social media has encouraged this ugly extremism and this runaway. I read something about a study. I hope it's true. This is how you have to preface everything you say.
Of course it's true. Don't show me any other studies.
Why play fights between children sometimes escalate. And it's because our perception of how hard we hit the other person is not the same as their perception of how hard we've been hit. So what happens is I hit you at 6 and you think it was an 8. So you punch back at a 7 and I think that's a 9. And well, I think a lot of people are starting to get tired of this escalating, divisive, hateful stuff. That's my sense anyway. And perhaps the pushback against that will be a more constructive and more moderate way. That's a hope. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's where I look for hope. Another thing is, going outside. It's quite helpful. I've been on Question Time a few times now. I like doing Question Time, even though people often message me and say, "Oh, give it to them, stick it to them. It's you versus 5 or whatever." I like doing it because I look out at the audience. I chat to a few of them afterwards, even ones that don't necessarily agree with my perspective. And I just get the sense that the ordinary British person is far more decent, far more respectful, far more sensible, far less antagonizing, far less divisive, far less rhetorically animated than you might believe by looking on the internet. And I think that's a wonderful thing about this country. I think we don't tend to go to extremes. Sometimes that's a flaw. And I think over the last 10 years, that has been a flaw. Our unwillingness to push beyond the cozy consensus of the center has meant that we've ended up in some bad places. But it gives me hope that when we react, we might not overreact as much as I fear that might be the case in other countries. So there's a fundamental sense of decency and peacefulness about this place that I've come to really love and appreciate. And I hope that can pull us through the difficulties that are to come.
Well, that's a balanced and nuanced and extremely hopeful note on which to end. Konstantin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.